So any of you who are joining from outside or will be joining later, I'm Lynn Lancaster, the Mellon Humanities Professor at the American Academy. And today we have two of our fellows speaking, Rebecca Levitan and Katy Barkan. And standard practice, each one will speak for about 25 minutes. And then after both have spoken, we will take questions. So I'll start with Rebecca. Rebecca Levitan is the Samuel H. Kress Foundation Emmeline Hill Richardson Pre-Doc Rome Prize in Ancient Studies. And Becky is currently a PhD candidate in the Art of Ancient Mediterranean at the University of California, Berkeley. She comes to Berkeley after obtaining a BA in Art History at Emory, where she was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa and named Undergraduate Student of the Year, receiving the Creativity and Arts Award. She then went to Scotland for an M.Lit, which she got with distinction, and that was in Ancient History at St. Andrews University. Since then, she spent lots of time abroad, and before coming to the American Academy, she held the Edward Capps Advanced Fellowship at the American School in Athens from 2019 to 20. The year before that, she had a multi-country fellowship from the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, also known as CAORC, for research in Greece, Italy, Jordan, and Turkey. Becky is also active in various field projects, including the Small Cycladic Islands Project with the Norwegian Institute in Athens, the American excavations at the Sanctuary of the Great Gods at Samothrace, the Gabi Project, which is one of the AAR affiliated projects, and the Porta Stabia Project at Pompeii, another AAR affiliated project. Her specialty is ancient sculpture, and she's also held a Mellon Curatorial Fellowship at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Today, she'll be speaking to us on the Pasquino Group, a speaking statue across time, and that's the subject of her dissertation. And then our second speaker is Katy Barkan, who holds the Rome Prize in Architecture. Katy is a Los Angeles-based architectural designer, and she's been a lecturer in the Faculty of Design at UCLA since 2014. As an undergraduate, Katy earned a BA in comparative literature and was also inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. So we've got two of them tonight. Before turning her attention to architecture, Katy had an early career at the magazine's Art Forum and Book Forum in New York. She then went on to get her Master of Architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Katy has worked for and collaborated with several important contemporary practices, including Architecture Research Office, MOS Architects, and the firm of Preston Scott Cohen. She founded her own office, Now Here, in 2017, working on a range of architectural scales. Her project, Half House, a single-family home in Los Angeles, won the AIA Los Angeles Honor Award for Adaptive Reuse in 2019, a National Honorable Mention for Best of Design in 2019 by Architects Newspaper, and was featured as House of the Month in Architectural Record. Her project for her graduate thesis, Grounds for Architecture, was selected for exhibition at the 12th International Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2010. And more recently, the installation 6 Work Surfaces opened at the UCLA Galleries in 2019. Katy's writing and design has been featured in Log Magazine, Pool, and Clog. She currently has 2 contributions in forthcoming books. One is called Aldo Rossi, The Architecture and Art of the Analogous City, which will come out with Princeton. And the second is Inscriptions, Architecture Before Speech, which will come out with Harvard. And today she will tell us more about her Rome Prize project in a talk called Big Small Thing, Small Big Thing, and Other Uncertainties. And we will start with Becky.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll try sharing. Can you see all right?
Looks good.
All right, great. So thanks to Lynn for the introduction and the Academy, both for the opportunity to present and for bringing together this generous community, which as of today, I believe is marking 3 months together. So happy 3 months, everyone. Over the course of this time, I feel really lucky to have spoken with many of you on this research topic. And I especially wanted to thank the members of the Writers' Workshop who have patiently read the early stages of research on this subject. And of course, Katy Barkan. I can't wait to see how our papers speak to each other. Thank you. So in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to try to cover the history of one particular ancient sculpture, which is the subject of my dissertation, called the Pasquino Group. And the Pasquino Group is what we call a lost Greek original. So it's an ancient statue, usually cast in bronze, which doesn't survive to the present day, but its composition can be inferred from other ancient copies and representations. In his shop talk, Dylan successfully demonstrated the perils of focusing on such lost types. And although the boundaries around those should be questioned, I'm hoping that the idea of focusing on one sculptural type can still be useful in certain cases. And in this case, it's to mobilize a traditional subject to do a sort of a-traditional study across time. And just for a bit of clarification, in the case of the curiously named Pasquino Group, all of the extant ancient copies are named after one copy, and that's one that's dug up in the Piazza Parione, or now called the Piazza del Pasquino, near Piazza Navona. And so they're all named after this one particular ancient copy. So in this talk, I will try to give an overview of the many lives of this statue type in Italy, beginning with the presence of several marble copies in elite ancient Roman collections. And then I'm going to review how this one fragmentary copy of the ancient sculpture took on the role of speaking statue in the 16th century. This is a practice where people post anonymous notes on the monument. This is a living tradition that continues to this day in the Parione district of Rome, and it will be familiar to some of you who participated in the February walk and talk. And then finally, I'll briefly mention some recent interventions to the Pasquino statue in this piazza, responding to events including the COVID-19 pandemic, and ask what this ancient statue can tell us about the collective power of monuments in our present moment. In doing so, I hope to show that the Pasquino is more than just a statue. It's an object, but it's also an idea and a tradition, and my research aims to study all of these things together. So during my time in Rome, I've tried to not just assemble a historical account of the monument, but also do some observation about the way that the statue works in the city, where words and poetry are so particular. And as you'll see, I've tried to include dates on my own photos as part of this documentation and process. So let's get started. For the ancient Greek warrior fortunate enough to emerge from combat alive, little was more important than recovering the body of his fallen comrade. Thus, it's not surprising that the theme of the recovery of the fallen warrior should permeate Greek visual culture. The popularity of such a recovery scene, where one living holds the body of a dead or dying companion, was an emotive subject particularly well suited for the growing interest in dramatic and narrative sculpture during the so-called late classical and Hellenistic periods. Appropriately, it was during these periods of history, a time dominated by warriors like Alexander the Great and his successors, that the motif of the fallen warrior retrieved by his comrade from behind enemy lines spread across the Mediterranean. Of course, the popularity of this theme was not exclusive to the ancient world or the Hellenistic period, and many variants are still ubiquitous today. So here are a few that you can see nearby. One of the most evocative visual examples of this motif is the so-called Pasquino Group. So here, the recovery of the fallen soldier has been reduced to only 2 men divorced from any setting. An older, mature warrior wearing a helmet and a short cloak strides forward in 3/4 view, burdened down by the limp, nude body of a younger, dead warrior who he carries by the torso. The head of the standing warrior doesn't look down to face his younger counterpart, but as we might expect, but rather turns out towards the viewer. And while emotive, his features are sort of ambiguous, allowing the viewer to complete the narrative. You can see another cast of this head in a picture from our visit to the Sapienza Cast Gallery, and perhaps get a sense of the scale of this monument, which is about twice life size from this image and a fragment that I was studying last year in northern Italy. So although this statue is clearly inspired by Homeric epic, the composition is inherently mutable and enigmatic, and the date and the attribution of the group, so who made it and what it represents, have both been sources of contentious debate. In the Renaissance, the group was identified with subjects as diverse as Heracles, Alexander the Great, and gladiators. This changed in 1936 when Bernard Schweitzer conducted the first systematic study of the Hellenistic group in an effort to recover the lost bronze original through all the ancient sculptural copies in marble. So Schweitzer was interested in elucidating murky issues such as the identities of the artists, the place the original bronze might have been designed and cast, and the subject of the group. So which Homeric heroes did this represent? At that time, the corpus was comprised of 11 copies and variants of the group, and Schweitzer wasn't able to see and study all of them. However, he was able to do something pretty remarkable with a set of conservators, which is that they made casts of all the extant fragmentary copies of the group in Italy, and then created this composite sculpture from the disparate parts. Using the eponymous Parioni copy, the one that we know well, he was able to determine the correct angle of the older warrior's head, and any gaps that he couldn't figure out from different ancient copies, he was able to fill using evidence from gems and other smaller media. So Schweitzer then studied this composite cast, and based on the differences in age, the hairstyles, and the nudity of the younger figure, he argued that the composition depicts the Spartan king Menelaus with the body of Patroclus, a younger warrior and companion of Achilles. And based on stylistic similarities to the Great Altar at Pergamon, Schweitzer dated the monument around 150, and scholars still generally agree that the original was probably created between 250 and 150 BCE. And if you get a chance to go to Basel, these composite casts still exist. You can even eat lunch next to them because they're in the cafeteria of the Plaster Cast Gallery there. And each chair is marked with the subject of the cast, so you can even sit in the Achilles chair. So Schweitzer's attributions were accepted for a long time and were only disrupted by subsequent discoveries of more ancient copies of the Pasquino Group in ancient Roman contexts in Italy, Turkey, and Greece between 1957 and 1989. So one of these was at the Eastern Artistic Center of Aphrodisias, where the sculpture was displayed in the Hadrianic Baths, opposite a pendant group representing the Greek warrior Achilles holding the body of his adversary and ill-fated romantic partner Penthesilea, the Amazon queen. And despite the vast difference between this display, which pairs the Pasquino Group and the Achilles and Penthesilea, a really similar one also occurs across the Aegean at the elaborate Arcadian villa of the sophist Herodes Atticus at Leucou in the Peloponnese. And because of these pairings, which put the Pasquino Group with the Achilles and Penthesilea, classical art historians cast aside Schweitzer's identification of Menelaus and Patroclus, and they instead said, this has to be Ajax carrying the body of Achilles. That way, both groups would include Achilles, and in one of the statues, he would sort of be the active warrior, and in one, he would be the fallen warrior. So about 120 kilometers south of Rome, the Grotto at Sperlonga was unexpectedly discovered in 1957 during road construction works, and more than 7,000 marble fragments were revealed, deriving from numerous sculptural groups that evidently adorned the marine cave. And the cave itself, which I hope we'll be able to visit later in the spring, is natural and it opens directly onto the sea. But it had also been transformed into a cultural space, a setting for dining in the late 1st century BC or the early 1st century CE. Its decoration included 4 major monumental sculptural groups depicting the travels and trials of a different Homeric hero, Odysseus. And the cave seemed to have been a kind of highly decorated marine dining room, which was meant to spark conversation between elite donors who would recline within the elaborate natural and man-made grotto. So what was a copy of the Pasquino Group doing in this cave that's all about Odysseus? Perhaps in this particular case, the sculpture does not represent Menelaus and Patroclus or Achilles and Ajax, but Odysseus and Achilles. This is a pretty slippery issue of identification, and it remains unresolved. And I guess you'll just have to read my dissertation to find out the answer. But despite the lack of scholarly consensus about dating or subject, the presence of the group at Sperlonga provides us with another key piece of information, but that in itself is also tricky. And that's because, unlike every other instance of the ancient copies of the Pasquino Group, the sculptural program at Sperlonga is signed by a workshop, a Rhodian workshop, of the Nathodorus, Hagasandros, and Polydoros. So at some stage of either design or replication, the sculpture can be associated with those three men. And those three men also happen to be much better known for their role as the sculptors of the Laocoon, another Hellenistic sculptural group depicting a Homeric scene. So the Laocoon was excavated in Rome just after the Parione copy of the Pasquino Group in 1506. However, unlike the Pasquino Group, which likely just sat in the dirt for several years, the discovery of the Laocoon occurred in the presence of no less than San Gallo and Michelangelo, and it was sort of magically recovered, seemingly intact. And immediately upon discovery, it was associated with a statue of the same name described by Pliny and installed in the Belvedere courtyard of the Vatican. And this statue was an immediate sensation. So Francis I requested the Laocoon from the Pope, Julius II, and he was met by an offer of a copy. And then a major diplomatic incident occurred when the copy was so popular that it didn't even leave Italy. So this was the sort of pride of the Renaissance. And it has a neighbor in the Vatican, the so-called Belvedere torso, which was also widely admired. Unlike the Laocoon, this 2nd century torso was highly fragmentary, but this fragmentation was sort of part of the appeal. So Michelangelo even refused to restore this statue when the Pope requested it, although he didn't hesitate to translate its form into other locations in the Vatican. So in comparison with these really iconic monuments, it might be surprising that this poorly preserved Roman copy of the Pasquino Group would even become important in the early modern period. And yet, soon after its discovery, the Pasquino's reputation spread quickly. So it was found right at the turn of the 16th century near the corner of this palazzo that was owned by Cardinal Oliviero Carafa and built by San Gallo. And by 1501, Carafa had installed the sculpture for public display in this small but busy area. And it seems that due to the extreme fragmentation of the second dying the lower figure, early passersby couldn't parse the composition, and the two warriors of the group became amalgamated into one that was given the name Pasquino. In the early years of the sculpture's display, the central figure was draped and decorated with Latin epigrams to commemorate the saint day of Mark, and soon a feast of the Pasquino was established, and each year the sculpture was dressed as a different character, such as Janus, Heracles, or Mars. And this practice of using the sculpture as a locus to post poetry that would then be sort of spoken by the figures quickly became more democratic. So the sculpture's name, Pasquino, derives from this function as a kind of early modern water cooler. A commonly repeated story says that the piazza was also the location of a tailor's store, and the tailor was named Pasquino. And this store was sort of a veritable neighborhood nexus of gossip because they were patronized both by elite church-affiliated clientele and more common people. And when the statue was installed nearby, the tailor shop's function as a gathering place and news hub was sort of transferred onto the sculpture, and the statue took on the name of the tailor. And it's sort of unclear whether or not this is apocryphal, but we know that the poems that were posted on the statue, known as pasquinades, animated the battered statue with the voices of hundreds of early modern Romans from a variety of social strata. So just like the anonymity provided by gossiping at the tailor's shop, those who passed by the statue could, in the words of Antonio Tabaldeo, facevano scuro della persona di Maestro Pasquino, so shield themselves with the persona of Pasquino. And we're only able to study this really unique practice because printers such as Giacomo Mazzocchi collected, edited, and published the poems that were posted on the sculpture annually from 1509 to 1527 in these volumes called Carmina Apposita Pasquino, so poems posted on the Pasquino. These pamphlets were traditionally organized around a theme relating to current events, and the mini anthologies now constitute an invaluable time capsule of the political, social, and religious life of Rome in the first decades of the Cinquecento. And it's maybe worth briefly saying that Dylan and I are hoping to create our own contemporary version of these pamphlets for our fellow SPEN project. So thank you, Dylan, for your collaboration, and to the Academy for their support in this project. Within a decade, the Piazza di Pariano, now dubbed Piazza di Pasquino, had become a popular place for posting and gathering to read and enjoy anonymous criticism of the powers that be and current events. And the Pope was a really popular target, so it seems in this period the Vox Populi was not always aligned with the Vox Dei. However, attempts to suppress the voice of Pasquino by the papacy were often foiled. In the case of Hadrian VI, who wanted to have the sculpture dumped in the Tiber in order to silence the character, the statue's salvation came from a Spanish ambassador who, quote, counseled the Pope not to do such an act, lest the Pasquino should teach all the frogs in the river to croak pasquinades. So basically, it was like a safety valve for people to have their anonymous criticism of the Pope. And aptly, the character of the Pasquino often remarked that he was impervious to many of the dangers that living animators would face. So in a Pasquinade from the reign of Gregory XIII, he says, Felice me che son di marmo. So I'm happy to be made of marble. With the rise of print culture and the increasingly affordable reproduction of images, the name Pasquino and his likeness became associated with humor, caricature, and polemical dialogue across Europe. And although the rhyming pasquinades affixed to the statue were normally written in the sculpture's native tongue, so Roman dialect, his growing international popularity was evidenced by increasing posting of pasquinades in other languages. By the 17th century, pamphlets of satirical Socratic dialogues starring Pasquino and his friend Marforio as the interlocutors were also circulated internationally. And popes often posted an armed guard near the Pasquino in order to silence the statue, but in true Roman spirit, the use of the speaking statue as a voice for the populace was adopted elsewhere in the city, with 5 other marble conversants, both contemporary and ancient, joining Pasquino in a Congresso degli Arguti, a Congress of Wits. So it seems like the time at which the copy of the Pasquino Group was discovered, in conjunction with its poor state of preservation and its highly public site of installation, created a sort of perfect storm. It was the right mix of democratically accessible and classically elegant. And because it was a public monument, the Pasquino Group fragment also possessed the virtue of being familiar. So it was both ancient and sort of a permanent inhabitant of Rome that allowed the character attached to the statue to observe the unusual and the sometimes ridiculous goings-on of the city and place that within a larger historical trajectory. So it seems like counter to the general art historical narrative, the sculpture's saving grace was its worst features, that it was old, hard to understand, and broken. He floated somewhere in the Renaissance imagination between the broken and the Platonic ideal, and was unable to be complete or animated without the addition of voices from its viewers. And although we might not find the broken copy of the Pasquino Group to be beautiful, others have. So perhaps the most notable was John Lorenzo Bernini, an artist who was really interested in the idea of making sculptures speak. And as his biographer Baldanucci tells us, Bernini was one time asked by someone from beyond the Alps what was his favorite statue in Rome. And when he responded, the Pasquino, the foreigner thought he was mocking him. But that was his favorite statue. Animated by the voice of everyday people, the Pasquino tells us the other side of the art historical story, with the characteristic long view, cynicism, and humor of the citizens of Rome. In 2009-10, the Italian government undertook a €70,000 project to conserve and sanitize the Pasquino and the other speaking statues of Rome by cordoning off the areas surrounding them and removing painted graffiti and posted poems, many of which at the time were directed at Silvio Berlusconi. However, this effort was largely ignored, and new commentary from Pasquino quickly reemerged, both on social media pages created for the sculpture online and on the statue itself, as you can see. And we can see that the sculpture continues to speak as a notice board where people post their thoughts in many dialects and languages, and there's also an online presence. And I'm really happy to see that the tradition of posting in Roman dialect, like the poem here on the left, seems to be very much alive. However, unlike an online message board, the contextualization of the sculpture in real time and space makes the consequences of posting seem very real to the public. So an anonymous author has the ability to watch others and read their contributions and hear their opinions. And the sort of analog setup allows for an unofficial social code to be enforced. So hateful and bigoted messages rarely stay posted for long. And here you can see a group of people looking at notes on the statue and a gentleman who removed one of the notes that he found unsavory. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of accidental temporary monuments or archives of this particular moment in history have been formed all over the world. And perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that Pasquino's speech also reflects these social anxieties. After all, since the Renaissance, his commentary has ranged from purely comical to highly critical, but it's always topical to current events. And the current lockdowns and colored zones are no exception. A relative lack of tourists in Rome, caused by the pandemic over the last year, created a unique situation where the Pasquino had reverted into a venue that was largely for Romans by Romans. And an exception to this occurred on February 26th when Italian-American artist Laura Ricciardi created an intervention based on her Silence Spoken project. And in this, she refashioned the Pasquino into a kind of secular modern confessional. So she would transcribe and post submissions from her website of things that people haven't gotten a chance to say to other people. But of course, as soon as Laura had completed her installation, a more multifaceted use of the monument resumed, and people congregated and began writing their own thoughts on the butcher paper she had attached, or attaching their own notes onto the ones that she had attached. And here we can see 3 notes that were attached by this local individual. And he told me that he had written them in English so that more people could understand them. And I also like that the middle note seems to have like 2 warriors on it, a standing one and a fallen one. I can't tell if that was a choice that was made with the Pasquino in mind or a coincidence. But it seems only appropriate that, although activated by an intervention, the monument almost immediately reverted back to its most inherent state, which is a voice for everyday Romans. And this is really interesting to me because traditionally monuments are conceptualized as static things, like a sculpture petrifying a moment in history to be remembered long after it's happened. But the Pasquino sculpture demonstrates that public statues, especially those in gathering places, are adaptive and they can really be animated and activated by passersby. So when I began this project, I was really hoping that my longue durée study of the Pasquino statue in Parione could teach me something big about monuments in our present moment, because much of the most recent discourse, especially in the United States, has been about what makes monuments bad. So how they can be racist and offensive and triggering and mobilized as sites of violence that really reinforce the worst in our history. And I was hoping that in contrast to those sorts of sites that have caused so much pain to so many people around the world, the Pasquino could provide a helpful counterexample as a monument that's sort of actually effective. And here, just very quickly, for the cartographically inclined, I wanted to show this crowdsourced resource, which actually has been very effective in the UK for mobilizing and drawing attention to certain monuments. So I was also thinking about the idea of the Congresso degli Arguti and how statues can kind of create dialogues with other monuments and make room for alternative narratives through creating conversations. And this idea in some ways mirrors what's happening with these big government-led initiatives in cities like London and with the Trafalgar Square Fourth Plinth and the Chicago Monuments Project. But at the same time, I really wanted to be mindful of not applying a sort of universalizing, or pardon the term, like monolithic understanding of monuments. And as I've observed over the last 3 months, the display of monuments in Rome means something completely different to Italians than it would to an American audience. And I'll let Katy cover this subject in her talk, but I just want to say this photo was taken on the afternoon that we were going into our Zona Rossa lockdown. And that same evening, just as his curfew was right about to start, I rushed to the Pasquino to see if there were any last-minute postings, and I encountered a sort of celebration in the piazza, including this man who asked me to take his photo with the Maestro Pasquino. So this was kind of an amazing reminder that the Pasquino isn't a monument to a particular person or time or event, but it's sort of a little microcosm of Rome itself. And that Rome is multi-generational, and the transmission of this tradition is always evolving. And anyone can participate. And a bad piece of news is that during the Zona Rossa lockdown, the statue was cleaned and all the notes were removed. But I'm confident that his life cycle will continue, and this isn't the last we've heard from Pasquino. And here I really welcome your thoughts and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. That was great.
Well, we're definitely going to have, it's not going to be hard to find the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So let me share my screen. And I will go here. You can all see that and hear me? Yeah, great. So before I begin, I want to add my voice to the chorus of thank yous to the Academy for making this time away and space apart possible. And in particular, I want to thank each of the fellows here for the ways you have shared your work with me. It has been hugely generative to hear the talks and to be allowed into the ways that you're thinking and your processes of working. And it is in this spirit of inquiry and instigation that I will focus my talk today. I should add that the nature of going in the middle of these shop talks is that all of my ideas coming into this have been thoroughly exploded, but not yet put back together. And so I think this evening I have more questions than answers. The title of the talk highlights a set of interests I've been developing around the questions of uncertainty as a viable aesthetic and cultural position for architecture. Generally speaking, architecture has to be pretty damn sure of itself, at the very least, on a structural level. But what are other possibilities that might be opened up if we look beyond the projection of certitude? What can be gained by loosening this posture? And actually, I'm going to put in the chat. How do I get to chat? Here, chat. I'm just going to post some links to some videos that I'll be showing today.
Chat is at the bottom.
Chat is at the bottom. I got it. I just have to come out of here for 1 second. And show. Here they are. Let's copy those. All right, make that big. Get to chat. All right, I put these here just in case it's choppy later in the presentation. To return to this, the title of the talk, yes, here we are. We got that, uncertainty. All right. So what better place to start than the obelisk? It is hard to imagine a form that has more consistently represented a metaphysical concern with oneness, a kind of recurring asymptotic desire for unity, abstraction, clarity, and singularity. The obelisk has proved itself to be an irreducible proposition, conceptually, formally, materially. Gio Ponti wrote, quote, "The obelisk is an enigma, sibylline and metaphysical. Not without reason is it engraved with illegible signs. The obelisk teaches architecture. It is perhaps the very symbol, the pure symbol of architectural expression." And while a certain kind of uncertainty is embedded in Ponti's Sibylline obelisk, the desire to imagine it as a pure origin aligns all too well with architecture's hegemonic tendencies. Instead, I would like to use this talk to try and dislodge some of this inscrutable fixity and propose some other attitudes towards monumentality and architecture more broadly. I'll begin by kind of charting out a conceptual framework, then I'll show you some of the work I've done recently that has led me to this, and then I'll end on some of the speculations that I've begun here at the Academy. So whether monuments belong to architecture at all is perhaps a good place to start. The architect Aldo Floss famously said, and this is his quote, "Only a very small part of architecture belongs to the realm of art, the tomb and the monument." Here, like in Ponti, the monument serves as a teacher, a heuristic. Floss's monument represents the very smallest sliver of architecture, one that is devoid of the pesky contingencies of function, labor, social relations, politics, etc. This is an architecture that can deliver directly that which is also not architecture, a pure symbol, an autonomous object. For Floss, the monument is a foil, the exception that proves the rule that architecture is fundamentally muddied and necessarily mired in everyday concerns. The monument represents a purification, a distillation, a miniaturization of architecture. But what about this position on the monument? If Floss condenses, consolidates, and excludes the many concerns of architecture, Oldenburg, by contrast, inflates, widens, and subsumes the entirety of the concerns of the city into his monumentality. His monument is wholly contingent on the city, literally disrupting the intersection of Canal Street and Broadway with its symbolic agenda. So while one attitude distills the larger concerns of the discipline into a small scale of the monument, another attitude enlarges the small scale concerns of the monument to the urban scale. I find this scalar indeterminacy fascinating, and it makes acute a long-standing question I have, which is, between the competing concerns of the monument and the city, where is architecture? And this makes me think of Bill. Where is it? So I've been seeing this oscillation between the monumental object and the city playing out in the many maps I've come across in my time here at Rome. This peculiar map from the early 15th century is amazing in how it renders the relation between the two. Here, the city is imagined as no more than a loose collection of monumental objects contained within the boundary of the city wall. The objects within are ambiguous in both size and scale, large things and small things standing side by side, victory columns co-equal with the boats in the Tiber. Here, Rome is understood as a collection of colossal miniatures, everything else in between left empty. Compare this to Noli's figure ground and we see a total reversal. The monumental object is rendered here as white space, taken back from the density of the urban fill. Noli's description turns away from monumental objects to monumental spaces, public interiors carved out of the extents of the urban fabric. See, for example, how he depicts the interior of the Pantheon in the same way that he would depict the Piazza Navona, both of them as a kind of interior. So in Noli's map, the monument is scaled by the city and that contains it, and in turn, the city is scaled by the objects it has internalized, each magnifying and minimizing one by the other. Now, rather than argue for one reading or another, I'm interested in considering these multiple qualities of the monument at once. They are both big small things and small big things. They are standalone and deeply contingent. They are both exteriorized and interiorized and fundamentally accountable to multiple scales at once. Read this way, monuments, and the obelisks being a kind of key example, are in fact more multiplicitous than their seemingly singular metaphysics suggests. If obelisks are meant to affirm the stability of such vertical hierarchies moving from the ground on up, then I'm not so sure where to place such an elusive object. To my mind, these monuments are far more uncertain, producing oscillations, incongruities, and category errors. And it is this indeterminacy that makes it possible to dislodge and contaminate fixed hierarchies, to expand the boundaries between the monument and the city, and somewhere in there, architecture as well. This image is a kind of exquisite corpse of the many representations of the obelisk I've come across in my research, and serves as an initial diagram of my work here. In it, I am attempting to isolate and juxtapose the many meanings, valences, ideologies, modalities, descriptions, imaginaries, etc., that are nested within this seemingly singular form, in order to see more clearly the many cultures, intellectual, material, political, etc., that surround it. And there's a few more, so I'll. I do this to widen the lens of inclusion, to admit not only the object itself, but the many conditions that surround it, claim it, figure it, and imagine it. I wonder what new forms and possible engagements might emerge from taking this broader view. So many of these interests and questions have been percolating and developing over the past few years through a series of commissions and installations, and I thought in order to put some meat on the bone, that I'd briefly show two recent projects that propose methods for enacting the kind of equivocations and uncertainties that I'm interested in. So the first project is an installation I did at UCLA Galleries in 2019 called 6 Work Surfaces. The project proposed to place unlike simultaneous and overlapping systems of value within a single spatial composition, imagining what might happen when a conceptual project is contaminated by a material or phenomenological one. The installation consisted of a series of odd white walls constructed to mimic the existing materials of the gallery, but manipulated to just skirt the threshold between what distinguishes them as a support of display and the object of display. Walking the line between object and space also invoked the ways architecture is drawn, built, and experienced in real time, and how each of these modes of description and reception shaped the work. So in order to move away from the white gallery wall and its attendant postures of authority and neutrality, etc., I was also interested in considering what other systems could be made apparent in the space to challenge, perhaps undermine, or at least problematize this singularity. To achieve this, I proposed a series of misbehaved and misaligned shadows, so to speak. These reified projections that are typically found in architectural renderings were conceived as volumetric carpeted figures that were allowed to drift and take on material effects of their own that cut against the abstract whiteness of the walls. While the wall figures might appear institutional at first glance, the plush carpeted forms domesticate, ornament, and queer territories of the gallery, flapping and curling over walls, lining them, furnishing them. So while the white walls describe abstract spatial sequences with fragments of stairs or corridors or rooms, the shadows swerved and spilled to suggest other directions and priorities in the space. As a result, the intense horizontality of the carpets juxtaposed the vertical figures of the walls, drawing attention to the ground as another kind of work surface, one that can carry with it a different set of values. In aggregate, the walls and carpets played together and apart to tease out a range of possible relationships otherwise unexpected in the gallery. As a last image, I wanted to show how this line of inquiry pushes back on the conventions of architectural drawing, which typically and dutifully segregate the horizontal plane of the plan from the vertical plane of the elevation. Instead here, I stitched the two orientations together to choreograph a series of productive convergences and divergences, imagining instead how the floor might run counter to the walls, allowing for competing priorities to coexist in the space. The second project I'll show similarly deals with mixing and shuffling categories of architectural work, bringing techniques of shadow projection into the built environment, and considering the functional possibilities of these representational conventions. The project is for a new media company. It's a commercial project headquartered in downtown LA, where I proposed to insert a large object comprised of 3 strange and very specific stairs into an otherwise raw industrial space. The stair elements are modular and could be recombined, and you see here 3 possibilities with varying degrees of compactness, intimacy, privacy, etc. But together, they knot together the core collective programs of the office. So that's a conference room, meeting area, lunchroom, kitchen, and phone booth. The specificity of the stair object was then set against the generic office layout, allowing the everyday activities of work to more loosely form, gather, and disperse around it. While I find stairs striking generally, and Danny can attest to that, for their sculptural qualities, they are also strange to me in their metonymic relation to the human figure. After all, a stair is always an inscription of the body. At the same time, the black drop shadow is a graphic device belonging to image making rather than to the built environment. And adding to this, I was curious how the changing effects of light and shadow in real time could produce further refractions and multiplications in the project. Working with all of this conflicting information allowed me to make something that flickered between being somewhere and being nowhere, between being big and being small, between being a thing and being space. And in both of the projects that I've shown, what I'm really interested in is cross-pollinating, siloed modes of working, drawing and building, abstraction and materiality, representation and phenomenology, and to look at what can be produced by a new kind of inclusivity. And so much of this really has to do with resetting the boundary lines and reestablishing the extents of my field of vision, and which is what brings me to my time here in Rome. Which has been really as much about cultivating a way of seeing as it is about finding methods of working. And here I'm going to play this video, and if you find it bothersome, you can go to the first Vimeo.
times.
All right. In thinking about the expanded field of the obelisk in the city, what I'm interested in is finding strategies to turn this one thing, this very one-ish thing, into many things, which turns out to be really hard. Much of how I've been thinking organizes itself around 3 ways of working that I'm exploring in this kind of triptych diagrammatically. The first is the displacement of the monument through its effects, some of which you may have seen caught in the video. And the second is thinking about the supporting structures and the kind of negative space around the monument. And the third comes out of a fantastic conversation I had with Tali at the column of Marcus Aurelius, where she related the story of Adrastus, the foreman overseeing the construction of the monument, who was apparently granted permission to use the scaffolding material to build himself a house. And I think this is kind of amazing. So the third strategy that's gotten me thinking about the possibility of making other structures that can sit alongside the first and somehow speak to that. So thank you, Tali, for that. One line of inquiry, and now I'm going to show just little snippets of things. So one line of inquiry has taken as a starting point the striking difference between the obelisk's plan, which is essentially just a single point, and the obelisk's looming elevation, which towers and beckons. And looking at how the experience of the two is collapsed on the surfaces of the piazzas and streets, and as you saw in the footage. I've been interested in how the vertical axis, which is largely out of sight as one approaches the obelisk, gets translated into the horizontal plane. How the scale, the distortion, the displacement, and the qualities of its edges, how we interact with it might suggest a new set of monumental forms that could problematize the first. And here are 2 early folded studies I made that attempt to grow the plan of the obelisk outward from this black square, and how this can then be reconstituted vertically to produce a displaced object, a double. You may remember, or some of you who were at the obelisk talk, that the obelisks, many of them used to be pairs, most of which have been lost to time. So the double is a recurring theme for me. So these studies are helping to flesh out concepts for an intervention in the city of Rome, as well as to elaborate methods of working with contested monuments more generally. And hopefully some version of this can be brought to life while I'm here at the Academy. But in these sketches, thumbnails really, what I'm exploring are ways that the obelisk can affect a broader space of engagement. How its displaced figure can rewrite, say, the symmetry of the piazza, providing territories for action and occupation, perhaps even some kind of interiority to the monument and to the city. In another set of explorations, I'm looking at hollowing out the monolith, a contradiction in terms really. And in these studies, I'm interested in using concrete, which is typically cast to produce solids, to instead produce a brittle monument with an interior. And to this end, I've been experimenting with slip casting, with the limits of slip casting, which is a way of pouring material into a mold and then quickly pouring it out so as to just leave a thin shell. But rather than use ceramics or plaster, which is a kind of more typical use of slip casting, I've been experimenting with concrete and kind of increasing the aggregate and trying to see if I can begin to scale up and see if I could even produce something somewhat occupiable. But this kind of slipperiness of scale is also interesting to me, where it's both an object and potentially a space. And I take cues for this exploration from drawings like these, which I think are totally stunning, and overlay the kind of geological imaginary on the image of the obelisk, and with a kind of uncanny nature lying within. And been testing these models digitally and with a series of kind of improbable material overlays as a way of further equivocating on their scalar and material effects. But essentially, what I'm interested in all of this is to look at things like brittleness, thinness, weakness, as an expanded set of terms that can destabilize the formal effects of the obelisk. And so it's very hard to figure out how to conclude this talk, as most of it has been mostly made up of beginnings. But in the spirit of uncertainty, which always verges on the edge of failure, I will end on perhaps the wildest speculation to date. And for this, I have to thank Stephen Parker and Therese Wadden for their collaboration and incitement. And here it is. Here's to many more uncertainties in our remaining time in Rome. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm sure that there will be lots of questions and comments. I will just start and give people some time to get themselves organized. So you can use the reactions for the hands, and I will call on you. So one of the first things that came to my mind with regard to the two is, so Becky's Pasquino, what was found in the early 15th century, and then it became like this talking statue. The Sixtus V set up the earliest obelisk. I mean, he moved one of the obelisks, but then he set up some of the earliest obelisks. And some of those inscriptions that we saw on Katy's obelisk walk are actually talking inscriptions. So the obelisks are talking. And I mean, that is a thing that the Romans did, but I had never actually until this moment thought about how the Pasquino as an object had started talking, and then the popes raised the obelisk, but of course the obelisks are talking about how great the Pope was who put it up. And I know suddenly I just sort of have this image of Pasquino and obelisk going, nah, 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 nah. Mm-hmm. So with that silly observation, Dylan.
Hello, thank you both for really fabulous talks. I think my most pressing question is for Katy. I'm really interested in the relationship between the sort of pyramidal form, the pyramidion, the pointy bit that is on top of conventional obelisks as we define them, and pyramids. There seems to be something about these forms that almost has a fractal-like quality, where a lot of Egyptian pyramids have sort of shafts that are very sort of obelisk-like that penetrate into them, that seem to relate to some of the questions that you raised about sort of elevation and plan, sort of moving from horizontal to vertical axes. So I was hoping that you might be able to sort of continue speculating on moving in between these two forms of sort of pyramids nested within obelisks and obelisky voids nested within pyramids, and whether there is anything that sort of speaks to the way that you've already spoken about axes in your work tonight.
I don't know if I have an answer, but I'm so glad that you talked about it, because I've been having so much trouble with that pointy pyramid at the top. You know, it's like, it feels like one thing to deal, you know, in fact, you know, it's gone. I keep taking it off because I don't know, it seems so at odds with the other, you know, but I think you bring up something right about how it resolves itself in the point that it wants to be somehow. Like, as if we cut the very plan of the very top, you know, we really do start to approximate the kind of nothingness. But I'm just kind of riffing here. I mean, I think that I'm glad you put that question on the table, because it expands for me the way of thinking. I mean, I can't help but think of a broken obelisk and the way that, the pyramid is inverted and enlarged, and then the obelisk is turned upside down on top of that in that project. So, as well as the fact that the pyramid, thinking about the pyramid as a pyramid is another way into thinking about an interiority, which is what I'm somehow after. So come to my studio and let's draw.
Francesca.
Hi all, and congratulations. Thank you to Becky and to Katy for these very interesting presentations. And I have a question for Katy. I am very fascinated to how you question the perentoriness of an object, deconstructing it in a very transversal way in terms of shape manipulation. From the drawings, when you turn the plan, the sections, you move them in the space, exploded them, till this very fascinating work with the floating and transparent volumes on the water. And so you really brought us in the space of the uncertainty and floating experience of the space after all. But I have thank you for this. I'm very fascinated by this kind of by this way you are following. I have a curiosity about the role of the shadow in your research.
Yeah.
And then light and the relation between light and shadows.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that what I was trying to say at some point is that, in usual manner for me, I've put myself in a really tight spot by choosing something that is so unbelievably singular, it's just like a damn line. How do you make more out of that? So the manipulation of the shadows is, this is a kind of term that I think about, like a kind of escape velocity. How can I find a method of working that starts to produce, other kinds of forms? How do you make something out of nothing, really? Because the obelisk kind of is nothing. Or, you have to look at a different level, scale of detail or interest, so that's hence the kind of looking at shadow is one thing, looking at, let's say, scaffolding or the structures, the negative space around the obelisk in a kind of, anyway, I won't bring in lots more things, but anyway, looking at that and then looking maybe at other structures. So the shadow has primarily worked as a kind of graphic device, kind of coming from sciagraphy, like another form of perspective drawing, right? And thinking about how that often is used to, let's say, reify or objectify architectural objects and give them a kind of authority, and to use them as a way of, let's say, displacing the object. But it's not the phenomenological shadow, right? It's definitely not that, right? So I'm kind of interested in placing that as a thing, as another kind of thing, whether it can then draw our attention to what it means to walk through the shadow, the real shadow, or to understand light in a different way. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it currently.
I just want to,
Thank you.
Before I call on Maggie, I just wanted to add a thought about that with the shadow. You guys, or at least many of you guys, have not yet experienced summer in Rome when it's really, really hot. And I was looking at the long shadow that's cast by this line, basically. And it reminded me of a time where there was an obelisk, and there was a dog sitting in the shadow of the obelisk. And then as the shadow moved, the dog would move with it, because of course it was cooler when you're in the shadow of that obelisk. but it's just this sliver. And so that little dog just kept sort of going right along with it. But it made me think that there's a sentient part of this. It's not just visual. There is you feel it.
Absolutely. There's like that one clip, which I didn't even realize that I had gotten, and I cut too short because I didn't even see the guy, but he just instinctively just like turned and walked in the shadow, right? And I feel like we're moving this way all the time without necessarily bringing our awareness to that. And so there's a kind of background, foreground that I'm interested in dealing with in bringing that in, but I can't wait for summer to see how, I hope they all,
Yeah.
everyone sits. But it's COVID, so it's all very empty.
Yes. So Maggie.
Hi, thank you both so much for those talks. I really enjoyed both of them. Lynn, am I allowed to ask a question to each of them, or do I have to just pick one?
You're allowed.
Okay. Well, I'll start. So Becky, I was trying to think of a question. Poor Becky got like 500 questions from me on her shop talk draft, but a question that came up tonight that I hadn't asked you yet. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how sort of evolving technologies over the centuries really have played into how you think people have interpreted and sort of received the Pasquino. So this could be like printmaking or even just handwriting. And then today, it seems like a lot of the project that you and Dylan are envisioning relies on digital technologies, social media. And I'm wondering, yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about how you see the technologies that have grown alongside the Pasquino changing how people are interacting with him. And then my question is sort of related for Katy. So I have to say, Katy, the things I'd already seen in your studio were so amazing, but there were so many other beautiful things tonight. One of the things that was striking to me though, was this sort of in the videos that you showed, like, of course, because you're taking them in Rome, there are people everywhere, right? Moving around these things and places that you're recording. And then in your drawings, of course, and even in like the videos of your own inflatable obelisk, we know that there's sort of people behind the scenes helping you make it and film it. But the actual kind of images are sort of depopulated. And I'm wondering if this is something you think about, if you could talk a little bit more about how you envision or choose not to populate your work with viewers and in your ideas about sort of engaging, creating broader spaces of engagement and shifting hierarchies. So
Becky, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you, Maggie, for that question. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I totally know my stance on the answer yet, but I think one thing that's interesting is like the Pasquino Group since antiquity has always been a conversational catalyst, and it's just a question of who is having those conversations and how. So it began in these like really, really elite spaces, only people who are really familiar with Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then over time, technologies, as you said, changed that. So in the early 16th century, suddenly print becomes a new tool where there's a whole new level at which anonymous writing can be circulated. And that I think is the sort of like spark that ignites the speaking, that like print and the development of print is a spark that ignites the speaking statues, even though a lot of them were written by hand. The idea that they were circulated was only made possible because of print, and literacy was only made possible because of print. And so that's sort of like one technology that's changed how they're received. And then film, like speaking statues are in film, and that's informed their role within the city and in photography, and they're sort of used as stage sets at various historical moments. So in the fascist period that happened. And so like there's sort of a deliberate staging of these with film. I think that's like an important technology, and one that like Dylan and I are really interested in exploring. And then, but what's so interesting to me in the 21st century is that they're sort of staying analog. There's this, although there is an online presence to the Pasquino, it's not its dominant presence, and it's not its most effective presence. So there's something to be said for gathering in real time and space. I think that's something that people crave, and this statue is providing a nexus or a destination for that. And so I think what's interesting is there is this sort of like dismissal of certain technologies, although sometimes people will put their like Instagram handle on the paper notes that they attach. And that's kind of like an interesting dichotomy. And also that there are a lot of poetry collective. I'm learning there's a lot of poetry collectives around Rome, and these sort of stem from the Pasquinade tradition, but most of them are now based in the suburbs. And they do most of their communication of like posting online anonymous poetry via social media. So there are sort of like Pasquino proxies that are totally online, but in terms of the power to move people, like the statue is still doing it analog, which I think is really cool. So yeah, then the question is, when we make our pamphlet and respond to that, like what stage of that do we want to implement, and what technologies do we want to use? So we're still figuring that out. But thank you for your question.
And, to answer, I think it's a really essential question. And maybe the last part of Becky's answer about when you said the sculpture activates that, right, is some of the ways that I've been thinking about it. So it's almost the way that I'm looking and drawing and seeing these things is like proto-anthropomorphic. It's like metonymic, I think, is better, where I'm interested in thinking about how the objects themselves like kind of occupy or produce or inflect. I mean, this is a very, in some ways utopian idea about architecture, that we could possibly like make something that would then have this impact on others. We could argue about that. I don't know, but I certainly don't want to do one thing, right? I'm kind of more interested in producing kind of moments of convergence and divergence rather than kind of something much more like kind of hegemonic, say. So I guess the ways that I'm testing that right now, because I'm in a studio space in an empty city without access to the public in a certain way, is kind of working on internalizing those desires within some kind of formal agenda. But I'm very excited about thinking about how to experiment and test those ideas in public.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you both. I knew these talks would be good together, but I think they sort of bounced against each other in ways I didn't even expect. And I guess I want to ask a question of Becky that kind of bounces off of Katy's methodology, maybe, and that Katy is really, I think, fracturing the obelisk, let's say. And I wondered, Becky, I think you did a great job showing us that there's this linear story, that these objects, this Pasquino continues to operate in a consistent way across the centuries. But I was wondering if you'd thought about like disruptions in that moment, if there's ever a time when it's not behaving in the way it seems to want to behave. And I don't know how you would think about that, if it's about, you also mentioned that it sort of served as a safety valve, right? And I think often in history, we've thought things work that way, and then we've found it's actually more complicated than that, like carnivals, for example. So I was just wondering if there are ways of thinking about ruptures, and if you could fracture that sculpture's behavior the way Katy sort of fractures the obelisk, whether it's about different class responses to this thing, or times when there was suppression and it didn't succeed in being the voice, or, who is the vox populi? Is it one group? Is it, so maybe, and I think to some extent the last question got at that too, because technology begins to do that, but maybe your answer was about consistency. So I guess I'm just sort of thinking about, is Pasquino actually more complicated than that?
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, I think I think my narration of this longue durée was definitely overly simplistic. And it's not that we have this continuous record perfectly for every single year, or that Pasquino's always on the good side. Like it's not. So for instance, we have a series of Pasquinades speaking out against Hitler, but not as many as you might like to see speaking out against Mussolini. And some of that has to do with the fact that Palazzo Braschi was the fascist headquarters for some time. So that might be like an example of how the space was like activated in a way that we might feel uncomfortable with. But I think you're absolutely right that it's important to point out when this trajectory is broken and that access to this tradition wasn't equitable and relied on being literate, and that's still true. And that, like, one thing I was thinking about with these folks that, you know, had that I took their photo or we had conversations is that they don't represent all people that inhabit Rome right now, and they sort of are. They represent people who can live in the Centro Storico. So, and therefore that's the audience of their postings. So yes, I think that's a really helpful suggestion to think about ruptures, and that it's not simply a safety valve. I mean, I think that's the reason that it wasn't systematically dismantled, is that the Pope saw the merit in it for that reason, but it hasn't always acted that way. So yeah, thank you.
Alex.
Hi, just thank you so much for that, both of you. It was wonderful. And I think especially at this moment, you know, coming from a country that's struggled a lot with its own history of monuments and the connotations thereof, it's wonderful to see both of you sort of putting some breathability back into that concept and some agency, which I really love to see. And I think my question started out as being more for Becky, but I think Katy would have something to say about it too. Well, wherein I'm wondering, Becky, why you think these particular talking statues invite a different relationship to them than we tend to experience with monuments in general. And I was wondering, is there something about the way the statues are constructed, or that their context is more movable, can be peeled off them in some way, or is it something about this specific city where I think it might have been Matt or Hannah who observed to me that fascist monuments also are not really the target of ire that we might expect. Like, their existence in the city of Rome is accepted in a way, and in a way that might also be as honest or more honest than removing the monument and forgetting about that part of her history. But do you think it's Rome or these statues in particular, or what? I'm sure it's everything.
Okay, I'll try to be fast so that Katy can also speak to it if she wants. Thank you for your question. I think there's a lot of levels to that. I think the simple answer to why these 6 statues took on this role has 2 prongs. One, they're fragmentary, either because they're ancient statues that were damaged and dug up and were so fragmentary that they never got accessioned into elite collections, and that's why they're public statues, or because they were defaced. So there's this sort of, it's much more intimidating. Like, I don't know if you saw the press photos of the monument in Richmond, where the second the first graffiti went up, suddenly it became covered in this like amazing graffiti. But it's like once something is damaged or fragmented, it's much easier to intervene, I think, like psychologically. So that's the first prong. And then the second is that they're on routes that lots of different types of people use to get to places that are useful. So in the case of the Pasquino, it was near the biggest market in Rome, and also on the papal Possesso route. So like lots of types of people would pass by. And I think that's why those 6 in particular. But I think the speaking statues tradition is unique to Rome. Like, there are other places that approximate it, and there are other things that do a similar thing, like Hyde Park Corner in London. But there's something specifically Roman about it, and I think it has to do with the literary tradition, with the relationship of Romans to Latin, with the relationship of Romans to graffiti, which I see Rebecca Zorak asked a question about that in the chat. So I think this particular thing couldn't have happened elsewhere. There are like statues that speak in other Italian cities, but the Congresso and the like way they speak and the continuation of the tradition, I think it is unique to Rome, and you couldn't replicate it somewhere else, I believe.
So, I can't really answer other than to say that I guess I'm trying to make the obelisks more like Pasquinos, and I think some of the strategy, some of the ways that you have identified their kind of incompleteness, their kind of ugliness, or maybe their, abject nature somehow is important to making them accessible. And so then I'm trying to figure out how to like chip away at this, like, that thing, and kind of find more porosity as a way to activate that. And maybe that develops, I mean, some strategies for dealing with our context, when, in the US or things like that, where there might tease out, like you said, more range of responses to contested monuments.
Paulette?
I had to unmute. What I'm fascinated by in this pair is the disappearance of the object under the act of ekphrasis. And with the Pasquino disappears under all of the post-its and all of the interpretation, and the object suddenly becomes something that is tangential to the remarks that are being made on it. And I would say that almost the inverse happens with the obelisks, which they are meant to be read, they're textual, they're texts, and yet those voices become something less important to the story being told than their formal attributes. So through the act of analysis, the obelisk becomes lighter, it becomes almost disemboweled, it evaporates, it flies, it becomes a negative of itself. And so the pressures of analysis that you're both pushing on these objects, or the objects themselves, have moments of resistance to what is being said as your own analysis sort of, they fade away under them. I think it's just a really interesting dynamic between the two of them that kind of invert each other. So what's your position on disappearing objects that you talk about?
The negative is very interesting. There's Bataille wrote about the obelisk as the kind of the death of God and the absence, right? And I think it's very true. And it's also Gio-Ponti's quote about this kind of like, it's no mystery that they're, no one really understands them. Like that kind of enigmatic, the willingness to just kind of put them aside because they're inscrutable or something like that. So that I agree with your point completely. I think that kind of, that's what I'm trying to build some of these kind of formal strategies around, like bringing it, like making it horizontal so we can see it and touch it and like be with it, the ruin, like there's, horizontality is many things, it's very different. There's obviously like a feminist critique in here. There's other ways to think about that: negation, interiority, horizontality, things like that. But I love your reading of it.
Well, we're getting on towards 7:30. I just wanted to say, make an observation about these two that I found, I don't know, just a very nice reaction to the period that we're in, because I think both of your projects have changed because of the COVID moment. But I also see that this has given you the opportunity to do something new that you would never, ever be able to do in normal Rome. So, I mean, Becky, you're getting Romans basically using the Pasquino. And I mean, some of those videos, Katy, that you showed, you could never get those videos when Rome is normal. And it was the man stepping into the shadow that made me think about that hot day and the dog following the shadow. But it only resonates because he's the only one there. If you had the normal, groups of people milling around, he might have still stepped in the shadow, but no one would have noticed it. So I think these two, for me, have really highlighted how the two of you have taken, what's a difficult situation and flipped it to your own advantage. So brave.
Until the Carabinieri came and like took the obelisk out of the water.
Oh, I wondered if you got away with that.
30 seconds. In slow-mo. Yeah.
Okay, well, buon appetito, everybody.
Grazie.